Bienvenue, je dois remercier Christophe Dupin, qui aujourd'hui est administrateur délégué de la Fiaf. C'était le secrétaire général jusqu'à quelques temps, et puis ça a changé, maintenant c'est administrateur délégué. Et je dois saluer dans la salle l'ancien secrétaire général, exécutif, pardon, Christian Dimitriou. Et je suis particulièrement erré de ces rencontres, que je crois très très importantes, parce qu'une des choses qui m'a toujours frappé de la Fiaf, c'est qu'on sait, en tant qu'associé, on sait assez peu de son histoire, qui quand même est une histoire extraordinaire, sur laquelle il faudrait vraiment travailler et connaître plus. Je crois que surtout aujourd'hui, surtout dans ces moments de grands changements, c'est important connaître les origines, comment les cinémathèques ont commencé, ont décidé de se mettre ensemble et comment ils ont travaillé sur les différentes époques, qui est un sujet, moi personnellement je trouve passionnant et richissime. Donc merci beaucoup à Christophe Dupin qui a fait un gros travail, qui nous permet maintenant de connaître mieux les choses, et j'espère que ce travail puisse donner dans le futur des vraies publications, des vrais approfondissements que je considère nécessaires. Donc, Christophe Dupin.
I was asked to do this in English, so I will do this in English. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today to talk to you about the early history of the film archive movement. And I would like to thank Gianluca and all his team at the festival for renewing their invitation after the first aborted attempt to get me here last year. It's also a great pleasure to see some of the students of the Fiaf Summer School here this afternoon, as the summer school is, I think, one of the most visible examples of the very fruitful collaboration between the Cineteche di Bologna and the International Federation of Film Archives. However, I'm not really here today as the administrator of Fiaf, but more as a modest film historian. And the origins of this presentation can actually be found in my past academic research on the history of the British Film Institute, and in particular, my study of the stormy relationship between two of the great pioneers of the film archive movement, Ernest Lindgren of the BFI and Henri Langlois of the Cinémathèque Française. My appointment as Fiaf administrator 3 years ago made me the custodian, in a way, of this fantastic yet little-known historical archive of the Fiaf Secretariat, which documents nearly 80 years of Fiaf history. If I say nearly, it is because the very early years of Fiaf are actually not that well documented at all in Fiaf's archive. One of the possible reasons is that when the German army invaded Paris in June 1940, the Fiaf Secretariat was requisitioned, and most of what was in the office was forever lost. This partly explains why hardly anything has been written on the origins and formation of Fiaf, and this is also why I was particularly interested in researching it myself. But for that, I had to rely on the historical documents preserved in other archives, and in the archives of the three surviving founding members of Fiaf, the BFI, the Cinémathèque Française, and last but not least, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where the early contacts between the first emerging film archives are particularly well documented. Today's presentation is a condensed and more illustrated version of two articles, one I wrote in the Journal of Film Preservation last year, and another one I'm currently writing for the next issue of the JFP. Okay, let's start. On the 17th of June 1938, the headlines of the French newspapers were no doubt focusing on the two semi-finals of the 1938 FIFA World Cup, which had taken place in Paris and Marseille the night before. Italy beat Brazil 2-1, by the way, and would go on to win the competition 2 days later. It is rather unlikely that much was written about another seemingly minor event that took place that day, an event that would, however, become a defining moment in the history of the film archive movement. I'm, of course, talking about the signature at the Hôtel Matignon, the residence of the French Prime Minister, of the founding document of the International Federation of Film Archives, soon better known by its French acronym of Fiaf, like its football counterpart. The first Fiaf constitution, which is still preserved in the Fiaf archive today, was signed by the representatives of 4 emerging film archives: the Cinémathèque Française, Germany's Reichsfilmarchiv, the National Film Library of the British Film Institute, and the Museum of Modern Art Film Library. What is always striking in this image is, of course, the prominence of the Nazi swastika cross. This alliance with the film archive, which had been set up by Joseph Goebbels at this very moment in time, just over a year before the outbreak of World War II, is one of the fascinating aspects of Fiaf's early history, but I'll come back to that. Although the date of the 17th of June 1938 is generally recognized as the official date of the birth of Fiaf, it's important, I think, to realize that the seeds of this project of international cooperation had been planted several months, if not years, before, and that the Federation would not become a fully operational organization for many more months, perhaps even another 8 years, depending on how you look at things. The setting up of exchanges of information, film prints, and related materials between the first emerging film archives very soon after their formation, and for some even before, was the result of the immediate realization by their founders that establishing international contacts was an absolute condition of their development. It would not only reinforce the legitimacy of their work and status at home, at a time when the preservation of the film heritage was a completely new and therefore unrecognized activity, and yet a very expensive one, but it would also help them quickly expand at an affordable price their still very modest collections of what they saw as film classics. Like these like-minded people also only envisaged the history of the art of cinema in its universal dimension, and therefore it never crossed their minds to limit their film acquisitions to their national film production, hence the importance of their cross-border exchanges. Of the 4 founder members of Fiaf, Nazi Germany's Reichsfilmarchiv was the first to be established in January 1934, even though it would only be officially inaugurated by Hitler himself in February 1935, by which time it already contained over 1,200 films of artistic and cultural importance. Joseph Goebbels, a cinema enthusiast who fully understood the cultural and political value of film, seemed to have played a crucial role in its constitution. In 1935, the Reichsfilmarchiv already had a new director, Frank Ensel, who had been involved in the making of a propaganda film for the National Socialist Party, which he had joined as early as 1928. Having traveled a lot in his youth, he spoke very good English, which would be very helpful in establishing friendly contacts with other archives. In April 1935, the Third Reich convened an international film congress in Berlin, attended by delegates from 24 countries. One of the many remits of the Congress was to discuss the question of film archives. The outcome of its deliberations was to recommend, I quote, the setting up of a film repository in each country for the collection of films of cultural, educational and scientific value, or showing the development of film art. However, it's unlikely that this event had a lot of influence over the creation of other archives or of a network between them, as many countries had actually boycotted the Congress. The BFI and MoMA were about to launch their own film libraries, and it is quite unlikely that Langlois' Cinémathèque project owed anything to the recommendations of the Berlin Congress. Instead, what we see as the very first significant step towards the establishment of serious contacts between emerging film archives was the 3-month tour of Europe in the summer of 1936 of John Abbott, the MoMA Film Library's first director, and his wife Iris Barry, the library's first curator. Their official objective was, I quote, to search for noteworthy foreign films to add to the collections of the film library. During that trip, the Abbotts met production companies, film directors, and anyone from whom they could obtain film prints of notable, mainly silent films. A less official aim, perhaps, of that trip was to assess the situation of emerging European film archives and to make contact with their leaders. In that respect, the MoMA Film Library played a pivotal role in connecting emerging film archives with each other that summer. Just before setting off for Europe, Iris Barry, who had been a film critic in England in the 20s, was invited by the BFI to write an article in Sight and Sound, in which she stated, I quote, "We represent only the American wing of a spontaneous and universal movement to preserve a record of the birth and the development of the art of the cinema. An interchange both of information and of material between the various film archives in Berlin, in Moscow, in Paris, in Stockholm, as well as in London and in New York, is what we must all very ardently desire." The first leg of the Abbotts' European journey took them to London, where they were invited to present their work at to the BFI's Board of Governors. Promises of cooperations between MoMA and the BFI were made. At the BFI, they found a key ally in Owen Vaughan, the secretary of the Institute, who, unlike the rest of the BFI staff, was a genuine film enthusiast. Her diplomatic sense, as well as her language skills, she spoke excellent French, would make her a central figure of the Fiaf project in the late 30s. The Abbotts' European trip then took them to Paris, where they met various personalities of the French film industry. And on the 10th of June 1936, they met Henri Langlois, and were immediately impressed by the 22-year-old Frenchman's sheer enthusiasm and keenness to help them. Langlois had founded a film society, the Cercle du Cinéma, with his friend Georges Franju, the previous year, and he was already acquiring a small collection of mainly silent films, thanks to the fast-growing network of supporters he enrolled among French filmmakers and producers. Langlois offered to help the Abbotts acquire prints, or whenever possible, negatives of French classics, either from his own collections or via contacts in the French film industry. He had a genuine fascination for American cinema and was immediately attracted to these two Americans who shared not only his passion for film, but also his interest in rescuing and showing the silent film heritage. He also quickly understood that in the context of extremely limited financial resources, the Cinémathèque Française, which he would finally register as a private association in September of that year, would have to rely on its networks, both in the French film industry and with the other emerging film archives, to expand his collections. He appreciated what a great ally the MoMA Film Library could be, because of its already impressive collections, its contacts with Hollywood, its relative wealth, and the efficient organization of both its preservation and exhibition activities. He knew an association with MoMA would also help legitimize his own institution at home at a time when the French government seemed to have plans to establish its own national film archive. After France, the Abbotts traveled to Germany, where they visited the Reichsfilmarchiv in Berlin, and were actually impressed both by its organization and the international scope of its collections, and by the very amicable reception they got from the Nazi dignitaries. To their great surprise, too, they were granted full access to all the materials they requested, including, I quote Barry, German films made before the present regime by Jewish producers, actors, etc. The only exception was Sternberg's Der blaue Engel, and I quote Barry again, on the grounds that it was a pornographic film showing Germany and Germans in a very unpleasant light, and therefore they did not wish it to be shown again abroad. Following their return to New York, the Abbots would receive no fewer than 29 films from the Germans, delivered in excellent conditions, unlike those received from other archives, as well as stills, posters, and other printed materials. Among the films were Murnau, The Last Laugh, Wiener's Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and Fritz Lang's Metropolis, no less. The Abbots then travelled to Moscow, where they found the ideological gap between America and the USSR a serious hindrance to conducting business in that country, and to Sweden. In their final report on their European trip, John Abbott did emphasize the importance of the contacts established with other film archives in Europe. But he observes that, except for Germany, I quote, "None of these institutions seems to have attacked the problem actually of preserving, apart from collecting, film. Some of these collections are very scrappy, and others composed of sadly worn or fragmentary material." The person who maintained the most active relationship with the Abbots after their return to the USA was Henri Langlois, as his sustained correspondence, especially with Barry, throughout 1936-37, tends to show. A few weeks after their first encounter, Langlois shipped several prints of 1920s French avant-garde films to New York for copying, including La Chute de la Maison Usher et La Surveillante Madame Bedet, and allowed MoMA to have copies made in Paris of his negatives of Fièvre and La Coquille et le Clergyman, among others. In return, he requested copies of Intolerance, Paris Qui Dort, and several Méliès films. Although very cordial, the partnership was not without the occasional frustration for both parties, as prints didn't always arrive as quickly as they would have liked, or in the good condition they would have liked. The first batch of MoMA films finally arrived at the Cinémathèque Française in early 1937. Langlois, who knew the value of gala screenings to enhance the prestige of the Cinémathèque, took this opportunity to organize a special screening of Méliès's Le Voyage dans la Lune, which was part of the shipment, to which he invited the filmmaker himself and the press to celebrate officially the first exchanges of films between MoMA and the Cinémathèque, as he says in his letter to Méliès. Throughout 1937, films perhaps didn't travel back and forth across the Atlantic as the pace first hoped for, but the bond between the two institutions remained strong. Langlois was the most generous of the two partners because he had a lot to gain from a long-term relationship with MoMA. He probably knew that a film preserved by MoMA had a better chance to be preserved properly than in the Cinémathèque's collections. In September 1937, for instance, when Langlois heard of the imminent destruction of a large collection of silent negatives from the Eclair Company, he didn't hesitate to cable MoMA to beg them to purchase the whole collection, as the Cinémathèque was unable to afford it. Unfortunately, Iris Barry declined, which, according to film historian Laurent Manoni, was the mistake of her life. Langlois would eventually manage to acquire the collection himself. If the collaboration between Langlois and the Abbots in 1936-37 was the most sustained one of all, it was not the only one between two film archives. Although hardly any correspondence between Owen Vaughan of the BFI and the other archive seems to have survived, from that period at least, the BFI secretary did start exchanging information and some films with MoMA following the Abbots' European trip, and a little later with the Cinémathèque Française. Among the early films received by the BFI were Jean Renoir's Nana from Langlois, and two early Disney films, Skeleton Dance and Steamboat Willie from MoMA. As for the connection between the BFI and the Cinémathèque, it was established around 1937 via the Brazilian-born filmmaker Alberto Cavalcanti, who was well known on both sides of the English Channel and happened to be friends with both Vaughan and Langlois. As a side activity, Vaughan organized a film society associated to the BFI called the London Film Institute Society, And she invited Langlois to lecture on several occasions in the late 30s. And this is the program of one of these lectures, screenings. In June 1937, Langlois wrote an important article in La Cinématographie Française, in which it summed up the development of film archives around the world to date, and emphasized the importance of the exchanges between these growing institutions. The article confirmed the pivotal role that he saw for his Cinémathèque in the emerging field. The previous year, in 1936, in a handwritten organigram representing his personal vision of the role of the Cinémathèque in the international network of film archives, Langlois had already made it very clear what a central role he thought his Cinémathèque should play. I mean, it's quite obvious from this chart, where he puts the Cinémathèque in that network. As confirmed by this drawing, besides his partnership with the MoMA Film Library and the BFI, Langlois developed a friendly relationship with a number of embryonic cinematheques around Europe, and in particular those in Milan, Brussels and Basel, the future Cineteca Italiana, Cinémathèque Royale de Belgique, and Cinémathèque Suisse. He acted as a very active spokesman for these emerging institutions and started exchanging film prints and other materials with them too. Between 1936 and 1938, if the Cinémathèque Française, the BFI and the MoMA Film Library had developed a friendly and, to a degree, productive relationship, there seems to be little evidence of a similar sustained partnership between these three and the Rijksfilm Archive in that period. In the fast deteriorating international climate of that period, it is hardly surprising. What is more surprising is how the Rijksfilm Archive would suddenly reappear on the international stage and take an important part in the foundation of the International Federation of Film Archives in 1938. The need for a more permanent and officially recognized bond between New York, Paris and London, and for the consolidation of bilateral cooperation into a more global system of exchanges, started to emerge in early 1938. Langlois seemed to play a key role in this development, but once again, the abbots provided the opportunity for the four future Fiaf founders to meet and develop the existing partnership further via a second trip to Europe. The pretext this time was a big exhibition, 3 siècles d'art aux États-Unis, organized by MoMA at the Jeux de Paume Museum in Paris at the invitation of the French government. This groundbreaking exhibition was not only the first comprehensive display of American art in Europe, but also the first to present film alongside painting, sculpture, graphic arts, architecture and photography. Abbott and Barry had devised the film section of the exhibition together. It included the 50-minute programs illustrating the development of American cinema from 1895 to the present, shown twice daily, a display of film stills, and a special exhibition on the making of a contemporary film. Langlois was very excited by the news of the Abbott's trip and the prospect of a get-together. On the 26th of February, he wrote to Barry, my translation, "We are waiting for you, but also Miss Vaughan and the young gentleman from Milan, with the greatest impatience." John Abbott arrived in Paris on the 2nd of May, a few weeks before his wife, and met Langlois soon afterwards to discuss the possibility of establishing a more formal framework for the exchanges between film archives. By initiating the project, Langlois hoped that the Cinémathèque would play a central and controlling role in the future organization. The 3 siècles d'art aux États-Unis exhibition opened with a private view on the 24th of May, and the reception hosted by John Abbott and Iris Barry was attended by Vaughan, Langlois and Frank Hensel, and therefore provided the first opportunity for all these personalities to discuss the Fiaf project together. From then on, Hensel, who by then was no longer the head of the Rijksfilm Archive, but still represented it abroad, was invited to take part in all the discussions. In a letter to Langlois on the 1st of June, Abbott confirmed in writing their initial agreement about, I quote, the creation of an international federation of film archives. This is the first time the name actually appears in writing. It made it very clear that the future federation should operate on a strictly non-commercial basis, principle which is still at the core of Fiaf's identity today. I quote Abbott: "The Federation will rigorously exclude any institution making use of film for any commercial purpose whatsoever." The protagonists also agreed that no more than 2 institutions would be admitted from any one country, and that each member would have to contribute an annual membership fee to the Federation. The representatives of the 4 archives reconvened in the Abbott's Hotel in Paris on the 9th of June, and then again a week later, to put the finishing touches to Fiaf's founding document. The minutes of these 2 official Fiaf meetings were duly signed by the participants, Abbott, Hensel, Vaughan, Langlois, but also Georges Franju, Langlois' friend and colleague at the Cineteche. During these 2 meetings, it was decided that the first annual Congress would be held in New York in the summer of 1939, and on Hensel's insistence for political balance, the second in Berlin in 1940. Abbott was appointed president, Hensel vice president and secretary general, again for political balance. Vaughan treasurer, and Franju was given the post of executive secretary in charge of the future Fiaf office, basically my first predecessor. Langlois, who had obtained both the post of executive secretary of Fiaf for his colleague, as well as the location of the secretariat in Paris, was only made an ordinary member of the board. The formal ceremony took place at the Hotel Matignon on the 17th of June, where 4 copies of the Fiaf agreement I showed you earlier were formally signed by the representatives of the 4 film archives. The next step was to have the agreement countersigned by higher authorities in each country, again to legitimize further the new organization. Abbott insisted that for now there be no leakage of the news of the formation of Fiaf, as he thought that a lot could happen before the agreement was finally signed by all parties, especially in the current international climate. And with a couple of notable exceptions, the secret was well kept. The 4 representatives hoped that Fiaf could start business on the 1st of September. From the moment the Abbott sailed back to New York on the 22nd of June, it was Olwen Vaughan who played a key role in the formation of Fiaf, especially as the first frictions appeared between Langlois and Hensel. She played an official role of spokesperson in Europe for the Abbotts, and kept a close eye on Langlois and Hensel, whose widely different temperaments and ideological mindsets could put the common project at risk. In the summer and autumn of 1938, she made numerous trips to Paris and worked relentlessly to ensure that the future Fiaf office, which the French government had agreed to provide at 2 Rue Montpensier, in a building which currently houses the French Conseil Constitutionnel, and I took this picture a few weeks ago. It looks very posh, but the Fiaf office was actually under the roof somewhere in a very, very small office. So she ensured that Olwen Vaughan ensured that the office would be ready to start work as soon as the official Fiaf announcement was made. She also supervised the appointment of the Federation's first stenographer, Dominique Blankavitz, to work with Franju. Although Franju got married earlier that year, he and Blankavitz would soon afterwards become a couple, move in together and would eventually marry in 1950. That's a bit of anecdotal Fiaf history for him. Langlois had his very strong ideas about the Federation and the role of its future Secretariat, and spent a lot of energy over the next months trying to convert his partners to his vision, but he didn't always succeed. For instance, on numerous occasions in that period, he tried to convince Abbott, the new Fiaf president, to accept his friends Luigi Comencini and Mario Ferrari of the Cineteca Milanese, the future Cineteca Italiana, as founder members of Fiaf, even though they had been unable to be present in Paris for the preliminary meetings and the formal signing of the agreement. On Langlois' recommendation, Comencini wrote to Fiaf on the 20th of June 1938 to formally apply for Fiaf membership for his Cineteca, anticipating a positive response. But John Abbott refused to go to this, and firmly repeated in each of his letters to Langlois that the Italians and any other interested organization in any other country would have to wait until the New York Congress to be elected members. The matter was made even more complicated by the fact that two Italian institutions were actually interested in joining Fiaf. The Centro Sperimentale di Cinematografia, the Italian National Film School, which Langlois referred to as the official Italians because of its formal association with the Italian state, and the Cineteche Milanese, the unofficial Italians, whose activities were largely clandestine because of their opposition to the fascist regime. Langlois made no secret. Okay. Langlois made no secret of his preference for Milan, but he confessed that it was in everybody's interest to admit both into the federation. However, despite Langlois' many attempts, neither of them would actually join Fiaf until after the war. If Hensel and Vaughan had the copies of the Fiaf constitution countersigned by their higher authorities within a few weeks, the delay in announcing the formation of Fiaf eventually came from New York, where Abbott faced his own difficulties. A tough interview of Abbott by Will Hayes' office in October showed that the all-powerful motion picture producers and distributors of America was rather concerned about the new federation, and in particular by the fact that MoMA would be exchanging films with Nazi Germany on a systematic basis. Besides, the serious war scare caused by the Czechoslovakia Sudetenland crisis in late September came very, very close to putting an end to the Fiaf project before it was even launched. In a very anxious letter to Abbott, Olwen Vaughan recounted her presence in Paris that week. I quote, "Whilst everything was at its worst, you never saw such a dreary town. All air raid precautions, no lights, and everyone far gloomier than in London." She reported that both Langlois and Hensel's morale was very low, and she begged Abbott to have the Fiaf agreement signed as quickly as possible to ease the tension. The Munich agreement on the 29th of September put a temporary end to the immediate risk of war, but this did not fool any of the Fiaf partners. On the 6th of November, Langlois wrote to Barry, I quote, we must expect new trouble no later than spring." In early October, John Abbott finally obtained the green light of his bosses at MoMA to organize a formal a formal signing ceremony. So he cabled his three partners to confirm that the simultaneous launch could be announced by the four archives on the 25th of October, which was done. And this time the press picked up the story, and the launch of Fiaf made the news in all four founding countries. The foundation of Fiaf was nothing short of a miracle, given the increasingly tense international context of that period. Yet, signing the founding document and announcing it to the press was only the very first and perhaps easiest stage in the foundation process. If Fiaf was going to be more than just another ineffective international body and actually served some kind of useful purpose, it urgently needed to validate its existence by acquiring a solid financial basis, set up a secretariat, recruit more members among other emerging film archives around the world to reinforce its legitimacy, and start exchanging films and other materials as stipulated by its statutes. One of the first symbolic gestures was to get some Fiaf headed paper printed. And that's a very bad photocopy of the very first letter I could find with Fiaf headed paper from the executive secretary Franju to John Abbott. Although the titles appear in French and English, I quote Franju, to indicate the diplomatic character of the federation, in fact the main language of Fiaf until the late 50s would remain French, under the strong influence of Henri Langlois. The Fiaf office was finally inaugurated at Christmas 1938, And once again, Olwen Vaughan made the trip to Paris at her own expense to supervise the opening of the Secretariat and open a bank account for the Federation. She transferred the BFI's contribution of 10,000 francs, which was soon followed by MoMA's transfer of 12,000 francs. However, it proved a lot more difficult to get the financial contributions of the other two partners. Hensel refused to pay more than 5,000 francs, especially as long as the French weren't paying. As for Langlois, he argued that the French government should pay for the Cinémathèque's fee, and that his country was already contributing the Fiaf office anyway. This, as well as huge differences in temperaments between the different protagonists and the threat of imminent threat of war, caused a fast deterioration of their relationships in the first half of 1939. Abbott and Vaughan grew increasingly frustrated with Langlois. Their correspondence in that period is full of complaints about his lack of professionalism, his vagueness, his constant changes of mind, and his mood swings. I quote Vaughan, "Langlois is charming as ever, but even less businesslike than before. I cannot get any sense out of him about anything. We receive alternate letters of abuse and friendship." Abbott also got extremely irritated by Hensel's lack of commitment and communication. In one of his letters to Vaughan, he wrote, I quote, "He must explain his position thoroughly or get the hell out." The situation between Langlois and Hensel was not better, and the language barrier between the two of them added one more layer of difficulty between them. Abbott also ran out of patience with the Fiaf Secretariat in Paris, as Franju reported very little about his work for Fiaf, or how the budget was being spent. And when he did report, it was clear that he was doing whatever he wanted, rather than what had been decided by the four Fiaf archives. For instance, Abbott became furious after Franju told him in March 1939 that he was spending most of his office time working on an ambitious dictionary of cinema with the help of his Cinémathèque Française colleagues. And actually, the Americans were worried that the Fiaf office was being too closely controlled by Langlois, a claim that was certainly not unjustified, and that would reappear at regular intervals in Fiaf's history. So in the first half of 1939, the frustration and mistrust seemed to prevail within the small Fiaf community. Yet, the first exchanges between the four member archives did take place under the auspices of Fiaf. And these two lists give you an idea of what was actually being exchanged in the first couple of years. If you can read. Now, what became clear in that period was that in 1939, the motives of the different archives were actually rather different. MoMA, the BFI, and the Cinémathèque Française were keen to quickly expand their collection of film classics before the war, as it was likely to put a temporary end to exchanges. In late 1938, Langlois wrote to Abbott that the main objective of their relationship with the Reichs Film Archive was to get as many films out of Germany as possible before it was too late. He was also very keen to ship as many of his prints as possible to MoMA for safety. As for the Reichs Film Archive, well, its use of the Fiaf network in the first half of 1939 took a different turn, as most of its film requests in that period became very politically motivated. Hensel was working for Goebbels' propaganda and information ministry, and his objective was quite obviously to obtain defense and propaganda films from France, the UK, and the US. Archived correspondence clearly shows, for instance, that between March and May 1939, he requested from Langlois a print of Double Crime sur la ligne Maginot, from Vaughan a print of Warning, a film about civilian air raids defense, as well as the British Navy, a documentary about the Royal Navy and manoeuvre. What is not clear, however, is whether all these requests were answered or not. The first Fiaf Congress, supposed to take place in New York in the summer of 1939, and announced doom and dead many times in the first part of that year, after, for example, Hensel demanded that the Congress be relocated in Europe, Langlois announced that he couldn't afford the trip to New York, and Franju fell seriously ill in June and was not allowed to travel. And yet, quite miraculously again, in mid-July, less than 2 months before the war was declared, Langlois, Hensel and Vaughan finally got on their respective transatlantic boats and arrived in New York in time for the first Fiaf Congress, which took place in the brand new premises of MoMA at the heart of Manhattan. I'm afraid there's absolutely no photographic evidence of that Congress or the Fiaf partners together before the post-war period. On the 23rd and 24th of July 1939, the four directors met for informal meetings, in particular to draft the new internal rules of the Federation, which would define the role of the Secretariat and provided an official framework for the relationships between its members. This would actually form the basis of the new statutes after the war. The Congress officially opened on the 25th of July and lasted 2 days. It was attended by the representatives of 12 countries, which may sound impressive, but if you look carefully at the list of guests, you realize that most of them were government officials who had nothing to do with the field of film archiving. And in 1939, New York was actually hosting a World Fair, and most of these Congress guests were actually representing their countries at the fair. The result is that nothing came out of their presence at the Congress. The Fiaf institutions, which were to join Fiaf, or the archives which were to join Fiaf after the war, were actually those with which contacts had been established informally, especially by Langlois, not necessarily the countries represented at the Congress. The advent of the war in early September, even though it had been anticipated by everyone, did change everything for Fiaf, as overnight countries of the four Fiaf members became enemies. The reaction of the different protagonists were different though. Hensel was strongly in favor of keeping Fiaf alive and maintaining exchanges between its members. Rather ironically, he even suggested to Abbott that Germany's increasing influence over most of Central Europe in that period could help Abbott obtain print from these countries. Langlois and Vaughan too were keen to keep Fiaf going as if possible. In late September, Vaughan wrote to Abbott, I quote, "It might be good to have something friendly and international existing through all this war, if we can keep it alive." The Abbotts, however, made it very clear that the Federation should remain dormant for the duration of the war, and that all exchanges should cease, as they were worried that their prints might be the victims of German submarines. Their prints crossing to Europe, that is. Several attempts were made by Vaughan, Langlois and Hensel to convince MoMA to remain active in the Federation. One letter, co-signed by Langlois and Hensel, was sent in January 1940, in which they confirmed that, I quote, that's the one, "All European members have decided to maintain the association and the membership fees continue to be paid." But in one last short letter to Franjou on the 7th of February 1940, Iris Barry admitted that if MoMA could not continue to be active members of Fiaf in the current context, she, however, remained optimistic. I quote, "I should like to affirm, however, that my faith in the importance and future of the organization, and our warmest hope to continue its activities in the not too distant future." There would actually be no further contacts between MoMA and their European counterparts for over 4 years. Now, where does this leave Fiaf? Well, as I said earlier, the invasion of France in June 1940 and the sealing of the Fiaf office by the Germans after the capitulation of Paris on the 14th of June did put an end to the Federation. Or did it? One of the first things Langlois did when he returned to Paris in early July after being demobilized was, perhaps slightly surprisingly, was to meet Hensel, who was still working for the German Information Ministry and was now based in the capital, in the occupied capital. Langlois explained in his various reports to the Cinémathèque board that his objective was to save the collections of the Cinémathèque Française, which had been seized by the occupying army. Sorry. There is little evidence as to actually what really happened between then and the liberation of France in 1944. As far as Fiaf is concerned. What we know is that the name of Fiaf still appeared in various German and French official documents until at least 1943. Langlois met Hensel on a regular basis until the end of 1941. The Cinémathèque Française and the Reichsfilmarchiv working officially under the umbrella of Fiaf, which by then seemed to have become Hensel's toy. As for the Fiaf office, or what was left of it, it was moved to the Palais de Chaillot, and Franju was confirmed by Hensel as executive secretary in September 1940. What he did exactly during the years of occupation is still not very clear, and I'm still researching this. Especially a number of Fiaf business trips to Portugal and Berlin in that period. But what it is clear is that he worked under the strict control of Hensel, who by then, since the 1939 New York Congress, had become the Fiaf president. It is hardly surprising that he and Blankiewicz were arrested by the German the American forces in August 1944, but they were cleared of any wrongdoings after a few weeks. By then, the wartime incarnation of Fiaf had really ceased to exist this time, and within a year, Langlois, Barry and now Ernest Lindgren, who had replaced Born as the BFI representative, were resuming contacts. The opening of the first post-war Congress in Paris on the 16th of July 1946 marked the date of the second birth of Fiaf, and this time its development would be unstoppable. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup Christophe, on a très peu de temps, donc je ne crois pas que... Mais peut-être s'il y a dans la salle une question, peut-être Christophe peut répondre, et sinon je profite pour te demander les sources d'information, c'est-à-dire j'imagine que tu as travaillé sur l'archive de la Fiaf et sur les archives des autres cinémathèques, au moins des trois existants. Et est-ce que tu penses qu'il y a encore des pistes possibles, donc d'autres sources qu'on peut espérer de trouver?
En français ou en English?
In English.
Okay, I'll do it in English. Yes, I did. I mean, most of what I found here, I found at MoMA, BFI, and Cinémathèque Française, mainly at MoMA actually, because they have kept quite an amazing archive. I'm sure there is more elsewhere. I know, for instance, that there is a big academic project to research the history of the Cinémathèque Suisse, and I know that they are looking at documents even from as early as the late 30s. But as I said, there isn't that much left, unfortunately, either as photographic evidence or documents, apart from the correspondence kept by MoMA and a few other documents kept either in the Fiaf office or in the other two archives. I've worked a lot on the. I know my predecessor did a lot of work before I arrived, and I have worked a lot on the paper archive kept in the Secretariat. And one of the things that is always a bit surprising is that some of the periods are extremely well documented, and others not at all. There are big gaps, and I really think. I mean, it depends on a number of things, but one of them is probably the archival fibre of whoever was in charge of the Secretariat at various times. But it's so infuriating when you have a period that is not well covered at all, and you can't always explain it. Obviously, moving office is never a good thing, and the Fiaf Secretariat moved offices almost almost 10 times, I think, over 75 years.
Alors, merci beaucoup à Christophe. Je crois que c'était vraiment très passionnant et très intéressant connaître un peu mieux les origines. Et j'espère vraiment que ce soit les commencements d'un travail et qu'on puisse voir bientôt un livre ou des études qui nous donnent une idée plus précise du commencement, de ce commencement tellement légendaire. Le commencement avec une guerre mondiale, c'est vraiment pas mal.
And I would be very, very happy for other people to write other bits of the Fiaf history too. And we're working at the moment on making the catalogue of the archive kept at the Secretariat available to everyone. So soon, once we've moved office next month, hopefully we'll be able to we'll be in better conditions to welcome researchers, and we'd be happy to help them, especially if they want to write about various aspects of Fiaf's history.
Alors, merci à Christophe et son travail extraordinaire. Merci.